You have no idea how appropriate that piece of music was. I'm sitting there, I love the way her intuition works. Imagine, if you will, growing up in a time where everything is totally safe and secure and comfortable, and you know that all your needs will be met no matter what. This is what is described in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, as the Garden of Eden. To be in a place where you just can relax and move from one thing to the other, creatively, artistically, enjoyably, feeling totally connected with all that is. And the reason Tress's music was so appropriate is we call that place the cradle of civilization. And it's a wonderful term. You know, the Fertile Crescent is kind of like a cradle, isn't it? Kind of rocking a little bit. And in that time and in that place, when those very first things that we call cities were beginning to form, there was a great mother rocking, holding, supporting, nurturing, nourishing all beings. And everyone felt connected with the mother. Everyone felt that the core of life was expressed through the earth as Mother Goddess. Now, it's very interesting. I picked up a number of things, of course, as I always do when I'm preparing for this. And the one that kept sticking back with me is Merlin Stone's When God Was a Woman. This is one of those turnaround pieces of work, kind of like The Chalice and the Blade. This one came a little earlier. And what she talks about is an experience that she had. She says, paying closer attention to semantics, subtle linguistic undertones, and shades of meaning, I noticed that the word cult, which has the implicit connotation of something less fine than or civilized than religion, was nearly always applied to the worship of the female deities by presumably objective archaeologists and historians. The rituals associated with the Judeo-Christian Yahweh, Jehovah, were always respectfully described by those same scholars as religion. It was upon seeing the words God and He, each time carefully begun with capital letters, while Queen of Heaven, Goddess, and She were most often written in lower case, that I decided to try it the other way around. And what happened as she explored this, and as I then went off and did my version of an exploration, is that we begin to realize that virtually every aspect of our culture is based on a reversal of truth. So that reading, Ruth, you did it again. You know, John Milton was a guy, but he got it. No, I'm teasing. You know, I'm not really a feminist. I'm a humanist. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that every being, as we say in our principles, every being is worthy of dignity, yes? And we live in a culture that sometimes forgets that, but I'm not just telling you anything new. So back to when Merlin Stone began to play with what would happen if we started looking at the historical and prehistorical information from the perspective of a capital G goddess, a capital S she. Oh my goodness. The world turns around. It turns inside out. Instead of being in a place where there's this person who is going to punish you if you do the wrong thing, there is a completely surrounding, supporting environment for becoming more fully who we are. Wow. And if that then becomes the place from which we are living, what actions do we take? What decisions do we make? Do we operate from the fear of punishment? The fear that what I might do might get me in trouble whether I like it or not? Or do we operate from the, what would happen if I tried this? What would happen if we created that? Oh my goodness. Oh, wait a minute. If I do that, then that wouldn't be nice for other people. So maybe I won't do that. It's a very different way of feeling. She went on, obviously, many more pages. And there was a place in here where she talks about the various ways that we think about men and women in our culture. And she's saying that there's when the archaeologists and historians talk about the goddess as warrior, the goddess as victorious, the goddess as supreme, they say these are strangely masculine attributes. And it reminded me, I think I shared this with you a few times back, this one isn't as clear as the others, but most of those figurines that were found, thousands of figurines found throughout the Middle East and the Near East and many parts of Europe, they were not your nubile feminine figure. And the archaeologists and many of the historians and scholars who found them, being generally younger than middle-aged men, declared them to be strangely distorted. Well, obviously they'd never seen a middle-aged female body. Yeah. And it wasn't until I got to that stage that I realized that. Maya Angelou was so sweet. She, as she was approaching her 80s, she said, "I had no idea that my breasts would go down to meet my waist." The deification and worship of the female divinity in virtually every part of the ancient world were all variations on a theme, slightly differing versions of the same basic theological beliefs, those that originated in the earliest periods of human civilization. It is difficult to grasp the immensity and significance of the extreme reverence paid to the goddess over a period of over 25,000 years. And over miles of land, cutting across what we would call national boundaries and vast expanses of sea. Yet it is vital to do just that, to fully comprehend the longevity as well as the widespread power and influence that this way of thinking once had. When I talk about the period prior to the formation of empire, and the formation of empire happened about 4000 BC in Samaria, one of the things I like to have us remember is that it was based on gardening. It was a period in the Fertile Crescent and well up into southern Europe and many other parts of the world, where people had 1 to 5 acres that included a small orchard and several different, virtually every kind of food they might choose to eat. They would have a few small animals, and that land and the house associated with it was usually managed by the women in the culture. And then there was a common area where there might be herds, and there would be hunting and fishing, and there would be athletic events going on, and often there were stone circles in this common area, and this would be the men's realm. And during the high holy days, which were at least 8 times a year, and sometimes in some parts of the world more like every phase of the moon, so that would be more like 36 times a year. I'm sorry, I didn't say that right. Yes, I did. 13 times 3. 36 times a year, 39 times a year. The men and the women would come together and celebrate that ongoing life. They might come together in other times as well, but they would definitely come there. Each of them equal in their realm, coming together as equals to share the sharing time, and then moving off into their own realms again. Each of them supporting the other in the community as a whole. Remember the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. That comes out of that kind of life. And then some strange things happened, and it looks as if a bunch of herders, cattle herders, cowboys, came riding out of the Caucasus and said, "What's this with gardens?" Right? And began to turn the gardens back into rangeland for their cows and other forms of horses and various kinds of things they were herding. And they were much taller, much stronger than the local men, because they were the glacier people who had lived on proteins for all of their lives. And the Caucasus was the last remaining ice age part of the world. And as the ice age began to go away and melt further, they came out because they didn't have any place to do what they were doing up there. So they came down into the valleys. That's a quick version of it. And and because they tended to be taller and stronger, and because they were herders, they reversed what had been in place. Their notion of how things were is one man has a lot of females. What had been happening prior to that was that women who were the householders might have 2 or 3 men who were relying on them to provide that function. And if you have seen, for example, the film Journey to Ladakh, which is the story of a very modern story of a village or a series of villages in the edge of Nepal and Tibet, where a number of Tibetan refugees went to, you can see how that works, that a woman may effectively marry a bunch of brothers and take care of all of them, okay? Well, in Sumer, in something that was written about 3000 B.C., it said, the women of former days used to take 2 husbands, but today they would be stoned if they tried. About 4000 B.C., 1,000 years before that was written, was when the guys started coming down and saying, no. We're the big ones, we're the strong ones, and a man has a bunch of women, not the other way around. And a man chooses where we're going to live, not the other way around. The only thing that remained on the surface of the culture, as opposed to what was going on underground, on the surface of the culture, the only thing that remained was matrilineality, because you can never tell who fathered a child, but you can always tell who mothered it. So what began to happen was not 2 equal realms, but 2 cultures. The masculine culture that was about accumulating more and more cows, more and more wives, more and more kids, more and more supporters, more and more stuff, more and more land, and the feminine culture that was about trying to keep it going. And the feminine culture consistently retained their relationship with the goddess. But they didn't share that with the guys very much, because the guys wouldn't understand. And the guys said, and it's very clear in the myths, and she talks about one in particular, there's over and over again, you hear the story of how the new god comes in and beats up the goddess until she finally submits, and then she becomes his consort, and he makes her okay. So now the goddess is the consort to the god. Over and over and over again, we see this in those ancient myths and stories. And then we see another variation of that in the one thing that survived through the Christianizing of that whole area, and that's the rites of Isis. That's the only one that survived, where the goddess is the strong one. And the goddess remains the one who deals with the jealousies that the guys have and who makes it work. And out of her strength, she's a strong, independent woman, which is what Virgines means, strong, independent women. We translate that as virgin. All right? Isis is the ultimate strong, independent woman, and she gets herself impregnated by her former husband, who has been killed by another god, and she still manages to get herself impregnated, and she gives birth to Horus. Okay? And virtually every dark Madonna throughout Europe is Isis holding Horus. And we can trace that from Egypt throughout the Mediterranean, moving up through Europe with the Roman Empire. And then the wonderful Roman Church adopted and adapted, as it did with all things, following Augustine's rule back in 325 AD. So, the cradle of civilization, the cradle of everything that has become our way of life, was literally a cradle being rocked by a mother, being held dear, being nourished, being supported, being supplied. And the women, even as they became less and less powerful in the outer culture, hung on to that. And we see in Jeremiah in the Old Testament, as late as 500 BC, so we're talking 3,500 years of this, he's saying the women still weep for Tammuz, which is one of the goddess stories of how one of the goddesses falls in love with another goddess's, one town's goddess falls in love with another town's goddess, okay, because each region had their own name for the goddess. And so as they're pushed together under the empire, the first emperors were these guys coming down out of the Caucasus, and they're starting pulling together all these towns, and each one of them has their own goddess. And so there starts to be these stories of how we're going to blend these things together, right? And early on in Sumer, we hear the story of Inanna, who has a lover named Tammuz, and her sister goddess, who is from another town, says, "Ooh, I like him too." And she whisks him into her underworld. And Inanna has to do the 7 veils dance to go get Tammuz, the lover. After 3 days, she pulls him out, and they have a restored relationship. This is a very old story. We're talking at least 3,500 BC. And we're going to see more and more of that. But by 500 BC, we have Jeremiah being very unhappy. 700 BC, in that couple hundred years, that period where, wow, the women are still doing this. That's not okay. We need to do something about this. But the fact that they were doing this is what allowed them to keep the household together, what allowed them to be able to be relating to each other in loving support, because there was no room for them in the religion that was being imposed on them by a different mindset at that time. Not just a masculine-feminine difference, but the taker culture difference of the Caucasus versus the leaver culture, to use Daniel Quinn's terminology from Ishmael, of the village, river, gardening cultures. Yeah. So we have balance and strain. Before we had balance and joy. Now we have balance and strain. And that's what we've been living with for the last 6,000 years. Along about the mid-1800s, because of the presence of the Bible in every home, a lot of those stories had been replaced by the stories that are in the Old and New Testament. And there aren't a lot of stories that have to do with women's lives. So what happened between the Gutenberg Press and the Gutenberg Bible in 1500 and the 1800s was women felt less and less included in the religious stories, in the spiritual process. There was no model for a woman's spiritual journey throughout Europe, and especially in the U.S. In the U.S., in the 1800s, if you had a house, you had a Bible. And it was probably the Bible that your great-grandparents had because it had the wedding and birth and death records in it for several generations. So this was what most people grew up learning to read. And it was a wonderful thing that held us together in many ways, but there wasn't any room for women in it. About 40 years ago, someone actually sat down and wrote a book called The Women of the Bible, trying to help us see that there actually are women in the stories. And there are many women. Naomi and Ruth is the one that I grew up with, surprise, surprise. But only in the Catholic tradition and the Roman tradition was the feminine adopted and adapted. And so in the Protestant tradition, there wasn't anything else. What that did is encourage women to develop the left brain, masculine way of doing things. And they began to say, this tension is not okay. And we began in 1843 to see the women's movement emerge in Seneca, New York. One very feminine woman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and one very left-brained woman, Susan B. Anthony, got together and said, we need to be thinking of civilization as including both ways of relating politically, economically, and spiritually. And they created the first convention in Seneca Falls in 1843. And Mary Baker Eddy attended that and became a physician as a result of that. And a number of other women who became leaders in various ways around the country were part of that. It took 80 years before the political aspect got dealt with, and we got an amendment passed that said, yes, women are capable of thinking and voting. And it took another few decades before the culture said, yes, women are capable of earning the same amount of money in many of the jobs. And not that we've actually done it, but legally. In a humanist culture, in a humanist environment, all beings, all human beings are assumed to have equal abilities. Different, not the same, but equal. And whether you show up as pink or purple or feminine or masculine or show up as both, all of them, doesn't matter. It turns out that back there in the cradle of civilization, if a man chose a woman's life, he just had to dress like a woman. And if a woman chose a man's life, she just had to dress like a man. That's it. Go and be that. Go and be what your heart chooses. And it turns out that virtually every major invention that led to the life we have today was done by women dressed as women. All right? I went back to one of my favorite things. You may remember from the 60s and 70s, Jacob Bronowski did a TV thing on BBC called The Ascent of Man. Wasn't that marvelous? Connecting everybody. The Ascent of Man. Well, anyway, it was a marvelous series. And one of the points that he makes is that the shift from being able to just be villages to being able to be what we call empire or civilization, which is a bunch of cities held together and with a consistent set of values, was what he said, a happy circumstance, a happy accident. Goat grass and einkorn wheat come together and we get emmer wheat. Now, emmer wheat has an interesting quality. All of the modern wheats since then are ones where you can blow off the shaft and be left with the kernel. The chaff, you know about winnowing wheat? All right. Well, in The Ascent of Man, he talks about how this is clearly a turning point in the community of Jericho. We have a marvelous thing in Jericho. There is this tower that has been built on every generation, or every few generations, and so you can go down in the tower and go down into the history of the city. And you can see where emmer wheat is now the form of bread, the basis for bread making. What emmer wheat does is make it possible to have agriculture instead of horticulture. And what that does is say, now we have people who are no longer part-time everything and going what their heart chooses them to do, but now we can have people who are full-time farmers. All they're doing is growing wheat. And full-time bakers, all they're doing is turning that wheat into food for everyone else. In the history and anthropology that I studied as an undergrad, that was a good thing. Looking at our culture today, I'm not so sure. When we look at the long-term sustainable cultures, when we look at those places where a village has been on the same piece of land for 2,000 years and effectively the same people have been living there and they've been taking care of 80 to 90% of their needs off that piece of land for thousands of years, they're not doing agriculture. They're doing horticulture. They don't have people who spend all of their time plowing and tilling and cultivating wheat and corn and oats and soy. They have people who are doing a little bit of everything, and they're growing a few of their, or all of their needs in a household by household basis. They're growing a few things, not one thing. Now, I grew up in Illinois, and I spent my summers on a farm, and when I got there, it was all, they did everything. They had the orchard and the garden and the sheep and the chickens and the pigs and the cattle, and they had the sweet corn and the field corn, and they had the oats, and they had everything they needed. I was 7 years old my first summer. My last summer there, I was 14. They were a feedlot for steers. They grew corn and oats and soy for the steers. I came away to California, finished high school. Before I graduated, they were bankrupt. Monoculture is not a good thing. The cradle of civilization is not, our lessons are not from when empire began. Our greatest lessons are from before the empire began. The consciousness that allows us to live sustainably on the planet is not from reading and writing and left brain activities and specialization and dedicating your life to one thing, and that's all. The consciousness that allows us to live sustainably on this planet is one that recognizes the interconnected web of life that we are a part and the dignity of all beings, and recognizes that we are growing spiritually and in every other way all the time. And it takes a lot of different activities to do that. So I encourage you, if you are at all inclined to do a little spiritual or historical searching, either direction, I don't care, go back and look at the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, before Sargon. before the empires of Egypt, the empires of Sumer, the empires of Babylonia and Assyria. Or look at the underground culture. Look at what was going on behind the written statues and all of that stuff that is his story. Take a look. Your life and your world will be transformed. Some people are saying, let's see what would happen if it were her story instead of his. Yeah. We are, as Emerson said, continuing the human journey. All history, he said, is biography. All biography, history. If you want to move forward in your own life, take a look. Take a look at what was in place before the world was what we were told it was. Thank you very much.